just my luck as you start filming, I've got a piece that's visibly damaged, but we'll go with it anyway. So, the way you would actually test a piece of flint to see if it was any good was by sound. You didn't have to break it open to see what it looked like inside. If you had a really poor quality piece, it just gives you that dull clack kind of sound. But if you have a scrabble around in a quarry or even on the beach, if you find a piece that's much higher quality, it's got a beautiful ring to it. It makes you wonder. Well, we still use lots of terms that are hundreds of years old, but the term that's got a nice ring to it could actually be prehistoric. There we go. And I kept that one because it kind of looks like a dolphin. Right, okay, so all I've done so far is use... I think if you look long enough, you'll see all kinds of things. So I'm just starting off with a hammer stone, and all I've done is trim around the edge. And all I'm doing there is getting rid of any thin, delicate edges that are going to be very weak. Just to make sure all of those very thin edges are removed. A quick grind all the way around, and then I can switch over to using
a mammoth bone.
I'm not sure I'd be able to lift one of those. This is a piece of red deer antler.
Oh, I thought it was the neighbour.
You would think this was made to work flint, because there's nothing better. Even all modern materials, metals, plastics, resins, nothing will compete with this.
Pumice stone.
Sorry?
Pumice.
Pumice stone.
Pumice stone.
For a hammer?
For grinding off.
It's too soft, it would just kind of powder. Yeah, it needs to be quite a hard stone. But this stuff it actually works because it's softer than the flint. But as we strike onto the edge, it allows the flint to bite into it slightly, so it gets a perfect grip.
Yeah.
So, here we go. Let's make some rubble. Now you can see this outer skin, this chalky stuff on the outside. It's what we call cortex. Now that doesn't produce a particularly strong or sharp edge, so the best thing we can do is get rid of that. But that's ideal because we need to make a cutting tool, especially a meat cutting tool, very thin. So it can, as it cuts, it can fall into its own cut and sink and continue to cut. And there's our crack, right the way through. Now it's still what we call a live crack, because you can see that there's iron being washed into this and it's stained it a yellowy colour. But I'm going to keep going and see what happens. So the tool I'm aiming for is what we call a hand axe. It's quite a deceiving name, because the term axe instantly makes you think it should be fitted into a handle. But the hand axe was purely a handheld butchery knife, with a sharp edge right the way around the outside. I've got one over here I can show you. There we go. And this is a tool that was used to butcher the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhino. And if you can imagine a hippo splashing around in the Thames, they were certainly there. And we found the bones of all of those animals with scratches and cut marks on the bones. That proved they were using these tools to cut the muscles away from the bones. So it was held just as I'm holding it now. And for a long time, whenever you saw illustrations of people using a hand axe, it was either held like that, not a good idea, it's only got to slip a millimetre and it will cut you to the bone. And the other one is where they're holding it in a piece of leather to protect the hand. But the missing ingredient was, we didn't find this out till we started using them for butchering animals, was the blood. Because once the blood starts to clot, your fingers actually stick to it, to the point where sometimes you've got to pull your fingers off. And as soon as that's stuck to your hand, you can then use the weight of the tool, these serrated edges, and the braking motion of the wrist to cut upwards and downwards. So you can butcher an animal twice as fast with one of these compared to a modern knife. Very, very efficient tools.
Yeah.
I've actually converted a few deer stalkers to using these rather than their expensive
Have you
steel
got
knives.
leather on your knee?
Yes, yeah, it's a big thick piece of leather because I'm always driving the flakes off in the direction of my leg. Now, one of the most amazing things about flint knapping that really struck me when I started is that it's all about the use of angles and symmetry. By striking the flint at different angles, I can produce different sized and shaped pieces. But when you think our ancestors first started doing this over 2 million years ago in Africa, we don't credit them with a great deal of intelligence way back then. But I think these tools say quite different. They had a working knowledge of angles and symmetry, so that suggests the part of the brain that deals with mathematics was already quite developed. It's all right. So you can see that cortex, that chalky outer skin, is virtually gone. Just going to keep working around the outside to try and get rid of that. As long as it doesn't interfere with the cutting edge, I'm not really that worried about it. Just makes them look pretty. There we go. So once I've got a sharp edge right the way around the outside of the tool, I can switch over to using a grinding stone. And all I'm going to do is grind off, again, the really sharp edges because they're very brittle. And I want those edges strong enough to confidently give it a good thump. This is a grinding stone, but I was using the hammer stone to shape it. So you see I'm grinding it in different directions. I'm turning it round, turning it over all the time. And that's because I'm looking for just the right angles around the edge that I can strike onto to help me thin it down. Now there's a very good chance this one's going to break, because you can see quite clearly now this orange crack running right the way across. And I can see it on the other side, so to that point it's cracked all the way through. How far it's cracked through over in this section remains to be seen, but there's a very good chance that part's going to just fall off. If it does, we just end up with a much smaller hand axe. Now, at the time they were making this tool, pretty much everything that fell on the ground was waste. And we know that because we found napping scattered like this, just as I'm producing now, that are 500,000 years old. And we couldn't just see where someone had been sat. Amazingly, we could see how they were sat. Because the person that was making a hand axe over in Boxgrove in Sussex was sat on his buttocks with his legs stretched out in front, working over the side of the leg as I'm working now, and it left a perfectly straight line of waste and then a triangular pile of waste that had fallen between the legs. So you can see actually how one of our distant ancestors, Homo heidelbergensis, is a mouthful, was actually sat 500,000 years ago. But when they put all of the pieces back together again, the only piece that was missing was the hand axe from the centre. Have you?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
It was found by my granddad's mum. It was verified by the British Museum.
Wow.
And it said it was a Stone Age hand axe. It's not hand axe.
That's quite a find because they're not,
I used
certainly in this area, we don't find them
My
that often.
dad used it and I used it.
Really? What did you use it for?
Just he just used it to cut
Right.
that.
Yeah, can't sending those.
Nothing like it.
But they cut off the sharp.
Now in later periods, when they were making, and we're only talking about 5,000 years ago now, they were making flint axes to cut down trees. And they were the first farmers. So they would have been producing piles of waste just like this. Lots of these nice thin sharp flakes. But they wouldn't have thrown them away. They would have put them to one side because they're perfect blanks for making arrowheads. So I tend to put the nice thin ones to one side and I'll play with those later. So here we go, more grinding. And the flakes off this end first. Some more grinding. You can see it's almost there. I'm aiming for what we call an ovate hand axe. So I want that nice oval shape to it. It's already nice and thin. All I've got to do now is straighten up those edges, and if I get the opportunity to make it just a little bit thinner, while I'm doing that, I'll take some thinning flakes as well. If I need to grind the edges back again to make them nice and strong. See on this edge I've got this little stack of what we call step fractures, so I need to make sure the edge is nice and strong there so I can blast underneath that and lift off that untidy section.
What do you want to do with that? You want to see those stones being used like we saw the other day? Yes, it's from there. There's a fire going on in there.
Be very careful around that cracked section. I'm not going to try and be too ambitious with that and get it too thin. So it's just going to hopefully be a feature on a completed hand axe. So I'm going to go for this little stack on the edge now. There we go. So what I'm doing is trying to thin it, keep nice straight edges, and work on the symmetry at the same time. And that's called male multitasking. I shouldn't go shouting that out. I've listed jobs already today. Straightening up the edges and putting on little serrations. I'm doing that by just taking fairly small flakes. Possible to go just a bit too balmy about the thinning of a hand axe, because we find examples that are beautifully thinned. In fact, they've been thinned beyond any stage that they ever needed to be. So that gives us evidence that even 500,000 years ago, before we were fully modern human, if you like, they were occasionally very fussy about how the tools looked. Almost there. So this was a tool that was used for somewhere in the region of 2 million years. So I guess if we had to pick one tool to represent the human race, it would have to be this one. And if it wasn't for these tools, we wouldn't be as intelligent as we are today. Because this enabled us to get hold of very high quality meat. And it wasn't until we got hold of that high quality meat that this started to grow, because it was just like rocket fuel for our bodies. There we go. Thank goodness it didn't break. There we go, so that's what we'd refer to as an ovate hand axe. And you can see the edges straightened up quite nicely, so you can quite comfortably hold that now and really get to town on your mammoth. Yeah, of course. There we go. There we go.
Excellent.
You can see how wasteful it was. Probably wasted about half of that flake that initially came off.
Can we have that one half price because it's got a crush in it?
That one's for the museum.
Can you show the camera?
Oh, well done.
Yeah. Just come in a bit.
And you can see that crack that had me rather worried, running right the way through.
Uh-huh. How thin is it? Show it.
Mum, look at this.
Brilliant.
Beautiful.
Excellent. So that's quarter of an hour, 20 minutes work.
Yep. They don't take that long at all.
They make you ring.
Takes a while to learn to do it.
Yep.
But, if you've done some napping yourself, you know all about that.
Excellent.
There we go. Slightly more symmetrical.
You want to plug for the website?
Yes, yeah, it's primitive-technology.co.uk. So,
And your...
my name's Karl Lee.
Thank you, Carl.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.